Hello, it's Julesy, and I am supremely excited to be launching this series, Focus on the State. 2020 has already proven itself to be an exhaustive year. The built-up frustrations that have peaked around the police brutality against the Black community are not at all comforted or assuaged with the idea that in November of 2020, we will be voting between two old white men. And it is very kind of me to leave it at that. But yes, we know 2020 is an election year, and more than just the presidency is at stake. I absolutely understand being wary of the presidential election, and every 4 years, suddenly hearing about the things this one person can potentially change. And for many of us, we don't really see the crucial benefits promised to us because the politics that impact us the most are our state and local politics. And so in this series, Focus on the States walks you through the pertinence of what's happening on the state, county, and local level, and that will address many of our concerns that have become national boiling points in the past week. Today, in this interview, I sit down with my North Carolina State Senator, Jeff Jackson, who walks us through the fight for power over battleground states, state legislators, and how elected officials could be and should be responsible to their constituents. I greatly appreciate Jeff offering his time and being so accessible. It's a great interview and the first one I conducted, so I apologize in advance for the echo issue that arises in the middle of the interview. Jeff is an awesome senator, and his candor in providing so much insight around the mechanics of power that state legislators hold is much appreciated. Stay with us on this one. I promise it's worth your while, and thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon who have made this series possible. So the correct term is State Senator Jeff Jackson. You represent Mecklenburg District 37, which is the district that I live in. I don't often give out this information, but for this time I will. So can you give us a quick overview of how North Carolina State Legislature is assembled?
You got 170 folks in the legislature, you got 50 in the Senate, you got 120 in the House. In the Senate, we each represent about 200,000 people. So the district that you live in and the one I represent, that's 1/5 of one county. But some people represent 7, 8, 9, 10 whole counties.
Oh, wow.
Because that's how much you need in order to get to, 200,000 people. So whereas I only have like one sheriff and one set of county commissioners that I'm sort of responsive to as far as local electeds within the district, some people have like 10 different sheriffs that they get phone calls from when they issues pertaining to criminal justice, or 10 sets of county commissioners. Also, I can go door to door in my district in a way that some of my colleagues really can't because people are just spread out too far. One of the things you learn in the General Assembly is just how big North Carolina really is and how it's really just a bunch of different states and different economies and different geographies all collected into one. You get this beautiful bird's eye view of how the state operates, the cultural differences, the economic differences. There's just a lot to learn.
I didn't realize that the Senate was only 50 senators, and therefore, considering how many counties are in North Carolina, that's a lot of different pieces moving around for some senators.
And we only have 2-year terms.
Yes.
The state only has 2 years. We only have 2 years. It's not like U.S. where you have 6 years. We're sort of always running for re-election.
Do you feel that keeps you maybe more liable to your constituents in theory?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely that upside because you can never let up on responsiveness if you're in a competitive district. And we can talk later about efforts made to decrease the competitiveness. So like the advantage of having us all running every 2 years is that a lot of us are very responsive to our constituents. The downside is that fundraising never ends, which gives a disproportionate amount of power to the donors and the lobbyists who control PAC money. So you get an upside and you get a downside.
Does that not kind of connect to the change in campaign finances? That was one of Mitch McConnell's goals, right? With what was it, the Supreme Court ruling under Citizens United?
Right, you're right. So it was Citizens United took a really bad situation and made it 10 times worse. Like nobody thought that before Citizens United, campaign finance was a good, clean system. It was basically this black hole, this cesspool of corruption. And then somehow we made it even darker of a black hole. So what we really need to do, it would actually be sort of the best of both worlds to keep it to 2 years so that we were very responsive and publicly financed campaigns like a handful of states have done. I think Connecticut has a pretty good model for this. So that's legislation that I file on a pretty regular basis. And as you can imagine, it does not exactly pass unanimously, right?
Yeah. No, not in North Carolina. We still have.
Committee, never once even been allowed a debate in a committee.
Yeah, we still have a ways to go. Okay. So, for someone who is politically unaware, where can they turn for information, insight, and/or education on how their local government is shaped, or what role they have as a voter or constituent in shaping the state government?
So look, don't overthink it. Do the local newspaper. The local newspaper doesn't have as much coverage as it used to have because we just don't have as many journalists as we used to, right? The General Assembly used to be crawling with political reporters. It's not anymore. You got a handful, you got a couple from WRAL, a couple from the News and Observer, and one from the Charlotte Observer. But that's still your best source in North Carolina. If you read the political articles in the News and Observer or the Charlotte Observer, they come out 3 or 4 a week. If you read those, you would be in like the top 2% of well-informed people in the state for what's going on with state politics. You really
wow. Okay. I mean, it's unfortunate though, because a lot of state papers are kind of disappearing and being dismantled under, like, as they're getting bought out by major conglomerates. And I think there's like a concerted effort to keep, the regular everyday citizen disengaged from the political spectrum.
I mean, right now, those two papers I named, the News and Observer and the Charlotte Observer, they're both owned by McClatchy. And McClatchy owns, I think, 35 newspapers in the Southeast.
Yeah.
McClatchy's also trading at like 35 cents a share right now because it's on the brink of bankruptcy. So even pooling these newspapers together into this conglomerate, which was not the ideal scenario, to your point, it was sort of a last-ditch effort to find a financial business model that worked. That failed.
Yeah.
So we really don't know yet what a successful business model for this looks like. I admire what Charlotte Agenda does because at least they've introduced a different business model that appears to be working. Some people don't like them for various reasons, but I think like they've proven a way you can actually fund journalism, and that's really helpful. We're going to need a new model.
And it's very helpful. You're very active on Twitter. So I've lived in quite a few states. I moved to North Carolina from Dallas, Texas. I grew up in Delaware. I lived in New York for 8 years. And I was kind of surprised in Dallas, which is a Democratic spot in a pretty red state. It wasn't my state senator wasn't very accessible. And so it's to come here and have someone who's very active on Twitter. I get your newsletter, you let everyone know what's going on with COVID and with the various updates, and you're pretty straightforward about what information you can give and what you don't have information on, and but just keeping your constituents informed. So it's really good, and I hope that more elected officials make that effort to reach across the digital landscape, especially since so many of the former traditional outlets for local news are slowly but surely disappearing.
And a lot of this is generational, right? I'm closer to your age than I am to the average age of my colleagues. So this didn't require like learning new things. This was just taking what we already knew and applying it in this new work setting that I had, which was the General Assembly. But what I find from my constituents is it used to be appreciated that I was on social media. Now it's expected. They expect, as someone who works for them, they expect me to let them know, keep them posted through Facebook, through Reddit, through Twitter, and through email. They don't want to have to call my office, so they shouldn't have to.
Right.
They don't want to get a physical piece of mail from me, so they shouldn't have to. Like, they get to set the terms of our interaction, and they tell me, we expect to see you on Twitter now. So it's part of the job. You just got to do it.
Yes, and I'm very thankful that you're doing it. So what does your role as a state senator accomplish, and how is that relevant to me as a resident in your district?
It's a great question. I think the easiest way to think about it is in terms of what we spend money on. 60 cents of every dollar we spend goes to public education. And that ranges from early childhood through community college and university system. That's 60 cents on the dollar. The next 25 cents is Medicaid. That's a 1/3, 2/3 match with the federal government. We pay 1/3, they pay 2/3. So that public education and Medicaid gets us to 85 cents on the dollar of what we spend. Mm-hmm. The next 10 cents is courts and prisons. And the next 5 cents is divvied up among 1,000 different things, right? Parks, interest on some debt that we have. So that's how we spend money. And in addition to that, the biggest thing we do that isn't spending money is writing all the criminal law for the state. Mm-hmm. You got federal criminal law, but that's not much of it. Most of the criminal law that exists in the country is written on the state level, and we do all of that.
And that's really important, right? So you notice with the presidential elections is when all of a sudden we have this discourse, like every 4 years, and then it goes silent. Well, the criminal justice reform kickoff has been kind of steady because we've got a lot of media. We had Ava DuVernay's 13th. We've had various documentaries coming out and highlighting the problem. I don't know how many people understand that what made the crime bill of 94 effective wasn't just that it passed on the federal level. It was that almost every state replicated that law on the state level.
That's right.
So a lot of our criminal justice reform, and I'm a creator for change. YouTube gives you a grant to do a social good video. So in 2018, I did a video on bail reform, and I focused on Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. It's interesting how different the state laws are, but again and again, the messaging came up that it's about your local politicians. So we can require the president to care about it, but if you really want to see a change that's going to affect your family or your community, it's going to come down to what your state legislator is doing.
What's interesting to that point, you're right about the 94 crime bill, how it was this federal thing that started a domino effect that you saw go across the country, and that included North Carolina. But you've also seen it happen where the last federal reform, the First Step Act, that created a ripple as well. So we passed the First Step Act in North Carolina after it was passed at the federal level. Mm-hmm. So even though we're writing most of the criminal law on the state level, we are incredibly influenced by what happens at the federal level for good or for bad. North Carolina it's hard to paint with a broad brush and say we're either behind the rest of the country or we're ahead of the rest of the country for criminal justice. You got to break it into a couple categories. There are areas where we're behind, and there are areas where we're frankly ahead. And that's sort of a complicated picture. I spend a lot of time working on criminal justice stuff because you can usually do criminal justice reforms without spending any money, $0. And as a member of the minority party, first rule, you don't get to spend any money. No Democrat.
Because the criminal system costs the state a lot of money, right? Like when we sat down with the foundation in Louisiana that broke down the numbers that Louisiana was spending just on, before you even get to jailing a person, the court costs, right, of litigating for things like, running a stoplight and, nonviolent crimes, and how much that costs the state to then collect bail because a person can't pay to be out of jail. So it ends up not really benefiting the state to house a lot of people.
Yeah, I think like $38,000 a year is what we spend on average for people we incarcerate. Mm-hmm. But for the reforms that I'm supporting, it would save the state money, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're talking about, taking steps that we're going too far and bringing them back to a more appropriate level. And so all of my bills are net positive to the taxpayer and net positive to the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they don't all pass, right? So
because it's private interest, so
all kinds of interests, right? Yeah. Also, just the age-old fear of soft-on crime. Mm-hmm. That's still a palpable political concern, particularly among the majority party, right? I've had them tell me in private, like, Jeff, this idea is perfectly good, but I worry about how it'll be spun if I catch a primary back home.
Nobody wants to become Dukakis on the state level.
Nobody wants to be Dukakis.
Most of my audience is not going to get that reference, but I'll fill it out later. We're too young. Well, I'm too young to know, but I listen to enough like Supreme Court and political podcasts that always reference when it comes to
really important.
Yes,
really?
They always go back to Dukakis and that election, and that is like the supreme example of why some things we think just make sense are so hard to pass laws on.
Over the last 30 or 40 years, like the era of modern politics, we've learned sort of through big incidents like that what these political kill switches are. Like how to press one button that ensures your political defeat. Mm-hmm. And so we sort of got a sense of what those buttons are. And that can be one, right? If you let somebody go and then they commit a terrible crime, that's the end of your political career at that point. And these guys use that to paint their entire approach to criminal justice. So it can be hard to have a rational conversation. One of the things I worked on that I failed I'm going to try again, but I couldn't get it done. It was about restoring people's driver's licenses. This is a big topic in the last couple of years because there are a lot of people, I mean, a ton, hundreds of thousands of people just in North Carolina who don't have a driver's license simply by virtue of the fact that they didn't pay off the speeding ticket because they couldn't afford it. So their license got revoked and they haven't had a license, which means they don't have insurance to drive, which puts all of us financially at risk.
Right.
So
and there's not a good public transportation system here, so.
No, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And these people are going to continue to drive because they got to get to work. And then it gets stopped while your license is in a state of revocation. It gets automatically revoked again for another year. So that starts a downward spiral. People haven't had a license for, sometimes a decade or more, all going back to an unpaid speeding ticket because they couldn't afford it. And this is now added up to hundreds of thousands of people in North Carolina. So the idea was like, how do we help these people get right by the law? And we talked about it for months, and we couldn't come up with something that made the majority party comfortable. We couldn't get there.
So what do they say? What is their pushback about reinstating driver's license? Even if you do it like in a tiered fashion, or you give them a specialty license, or like
soft on crime.
Soft on getting your driver's license back is soft on crime.
Soft on crime.
Yikes. And it's interesting though, like I learned that in North Carolina, if you pay your rent late, you get evicted. So New York is a tenant. New York City is a tenant-friendly city, right? So it takes about 3 to 4 months because I tried to evict somebody to get somebody evicted. In North Carolina, it takes about 30 days. I think in South Carolina, it takes about 15 if you pay your rent late once. And then you don't have any recourse in appealing or like paying penalties and getting it off your record. And that impact, I don't think, like housing can impact so many other things. Your ability to procure housing, your ability to afford housing. Like it has all these ripple effects. And it's like, we're just so worried about this hypothetical, super violent criminal that we pass these laws that really just hurt the everyday citizen who might have, not fully stopped at a red light or...
You're right, and I think it's a very interesting similarity between the issue of criminal justice and the issue of affordable housing. In that both of these have sort of risen to the fore in the last few years. There's been a clear ascendance of those two issues. Like people like my mom, who don't really follow politics every single day. My mom's like, affordable housing is a major problem. He hasn't rented in 30 years, right? They have heard that. To reach her level shows you've made real political progress and awareness on that issue.
Okay. So you have a law degree. So you have an undergraduate degree from Emory, and then you have a law degree from UNC Chapel Hill. So do you need a law degree to run for office?
No, you don't need a law degree, and that would be terrible, right? We have a really good, not great, we have a pretty good diversity of professional background and life experience background. We've got small business owners. I don't think we have any teachers right now. We should probably have some teachers. We have nurses. We have some car dealers. We have some farmers. The farmers, by the way, routinely educate us on what life is like, the realities of having a modern farm in North Carolina. I've learned a lot.
I would love to learn. I miss being able to buy directly from farmers when I was in Texas.
We have a water.
And I was like, where is my, because, there's no chicken at Costco, so let me go find my local farmer.
There are people in the General Assembly who will hook you up with a chicken.
Yes. Okay. No, I really used to drive to the farms when I lived in Texas and just get my, to carry on to what you were talking about the diversity of life experiences. Do you have any thoughts on the commonality of lawyers as elected officials and how that impacts their constituency?
Yeah, you don't want everyone being like there are clear downsides to being a density of lawyers in a legislative body. But there are, and I think we sort of know what those are. And by the way, lawyers take a ton of crap in the General Assembly. There aren't a ton of us, but they're a pretty healthy number. I don't know, maybe 10% or something like that. And we all take a ton of crap for it. Kind of in a good-natured way, but sometimes kind of not.
Yeah.
And yet, we do a lot of overtime there. Like people, after they write their bills, they bring them to us. And they're like, hey, will you read this and give me your thoughts? And that's fine. Like, that's the way it should be. I think having a sizable chunk of the legislative body have a legal background is helpful for that purpose of helping other voices who want a legal review of their draft before they submit it to the rest of their colleagues. I think that's a good service, sort of internal to a legislative body that you can offer.
What are the hurdles that you've incurred and noticed in general in running for local office?
The biggest hurdle is that people just don't have a frame of reference for our existence, right? So like I used to do door to door a lot every single weekend until this pandemic. And I've gotten pretty good at introducing people not only to me, but to the concept of a state senator because they're real fuzzy on our existence. So I say, hey, I'm Jeff, I'm your state senator. And they start talking about DC. And I say, well, no, I'm your state senator. We're in Raleigh. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, okay, well, you've got a state government. You have a state legislature here. And it's a legislative body that functions, and you have to sort of redo the civics lesson for them. So you can't really ask people to get that geared up about issues like statewide criminal justice or Medicaid expansion or voters like gerrymandering stuff before they have a concept of who you are and the role that you play in their lives. So you got to start there. You can never assume too much prior knowledge on their part. You just can't. People are busy.
Do we get a civics lessons? I don't remember in school being taught about the state legislature.
I assume we were, but I don't really remember either.
You know, like it's always been, federal. There's 3 branches of government and nobody's talking about the state level. So,
and I would say that's a failure in our curriculum and they should teach it, but I'm not sure if they did, the kids would remember because it would take like 15 minutes to say everything on the federal side that exists on the state side too. Like, would that really be effective? I don't know.
You'd be surprised what kids remember from like science class. And like if it's turned into like a cartoon and there's a segment on Sesame Street and, the magical school bus, you turn it into a good, ditty. Like it works. It works.
You know what put us on the map here in North Carolina? It was the only time where I started going door to door. I didn't have to really tell people who I was. HB2 put us on the map.
Oh, okay. Oh, the bathroom bill.
When we screw up mass, it puts us on the map. People are like, oh, we remember you exist now. And we have some things we need to talk about.
Oh, man.
I don't know when you moved to Charlotte, but
2018, fall of 2018.
Okay, so before you got here, in 2014, there was a big fight over the airport because the General Assembly tried to take ownership, basically, of the Charlotte airport. And everyone in Charlotte was very much against it. So when I was going door to door, that was my first campaign. Everybody wanted to talk about the airport. They knew me through that one issue. And that was the same with HB2 times a million. That was a much bigger deal. And now with this pandemic, this is sort of the next time we've had the spotlight put on us. HB2 was a brighter spotlight, frankly, but this one's pretty bright and people are remembering, oh, we have a state government and it really matters if they do a good or bad job.
Well, I'm surprised that the special session that was called in December 2016 after Roy Cooper was elected didn't also put you guys on the map. And you were part of that legislative session. So can you speak to the significance of that special session?
I can. I remember it well. There were actually 2. The first one we knew was going to happen. The second was a surprise. The first one was about hurricane response. So they brought us there under the auspice of a disaster relief bill for a hurricane that had just struck. So we passed this hurricane bill, and I'm sitting in my desk on the Senate floor, and they call it for a vote, and we vote for it. I think it passes unanimously. And cleaning up my papers because we're done here, right? No. The leader stands up. He says, I'm now calling us into a second special session starting right now. This has never been done before in the history of the state. And then he tells us what the bill, the session is going to be about. And it's about stripping as much power from the newly elected, but not yet inaugurated governor of North Carolina, the incoming governor. And it was just this horrendous power grab, this overt corruption, just totally indefensible. They didn't give a shit. Because they decided, you know what, we'll take the hit from the public because it'll be worth it when we protect ourselves and get some more power. And you know what, they basically got away with it. They never paid a huge.
I don't think these things are happening in like state tunnels, right? Because the roadmaps are very similar from Wisconsin and other states that, when you go from a Republican governor to a Democrat governor, and you still have a legislative body controlled by the Republican Party, that there are, I don't know what we would call them. There are powers that be that help the strategy
Right.
and say, we're going to put this concerted effort together, and here's how we go about it, and here's how we can get away with doing said things.
I mean, I think that's right. The flavor is the same, but the strategy, or the flavors are different, but the strategy is basically the same. The big pieces are basically the same. And Wisconsin's a very good example. They were the only one that really rivals North Carolina as far as the shamelessness of the power grab.
That's kind of sad. Can you explain the influence of the state legislator this is going to be connected to that special session, and how things like Senate replacements are handled? So currently we have a senator who sits on the Hill, Senator Burr, who has been in the news for selling off stock after he attended a joint January 24th Senate Health and Foreign Relations Committee briefing on coronavirus, while downplaying the oncoming pandemic to the public. So how are calls for his resignation connected to the influence and power of the state legislation?
That's a great question. It relates to the conversation we just had. So in 2018, the majority party changed the law about what would happen under these circumstances. It used to be that the governor would pick the replacement. If a senator didn't finish his or her term for whatever reason, the governor gets to pick and pretty much has carte blanche to pick whomever he or she wants. But because he was a Democrat, the governor or the General Assembly passed a law in 2018 to tie his hands and say, no, we give you a list of 3 names and you have to pick from one of those 3. So if Burr stepped down, he would be replaced by someone that the state executive committee, which is like the high tower Republican committee, would pick, basically.
Yes, which is why we now see a bipartisan call. Because I was like, wait, why are Republicans calling for his resignation? Something's up. Right. And then I went and looked up the bill, and I was like, oh.
There's no reason for them not to.
Oh, okay. That's an easy one. So North Carolina is in the midst of an ongoing battle with regards to its congressional map. In October 2019, the state court ruled that the congressional map was illegal thanks to its blatant partisan intent. And I feel like you tweeted something about something happening during one of the legislative sessions where one of your members of the body, one of the other senators, made a comment about, well, yeah, we gave you this many points, and now, like, he just was kind of owning up to the fact that the way the congressional map was redrawn was intentful and they know what they're doing. Can you make this make sense for the regular folks? Why are these maps important?
Gerrymandering map drawing is the total political power in North Carolina. As bad as you think money in politics is, that's nothing compared to the power of being able to draw the map. Money is influencing the outcome. Drawing the map is wholesale determining the outcome. And before we go any further, my party did this for decades. My party cheated to win elections by using the power to draw the map for decades. And all the Republicans who are in charge right now all filed bills to end that practice, gerrymandering, while they were in the minority. And my party threw all those bills in the trash can because we never thought we'd be out of power. And then as soon as Republicans took over, the first thing we said was, how about no more gerrymandering? And the Republicans said, how about epic payback? And that's what they've done. Only they have all of this data and computing power that my party never did. So they're able to turn, my party's art of cheating into a high science.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things also is the RNC, I want to say, post. I'm going to go something, the Southern strategy ticked off with Nixon, but then I think there's been research around post Clinton, how the RNC has made a dedicated effort down ballot to focus on state and local elections because they knew that they could never keep power in the White House, but that if they controlled the state government, who's in the White House doesn't matter.
That's right. So it was going into 2010, the election 2010. It's called Operation Red Map. And it was a federal Republican effort to flip as many state legislatures as possible because they knew that would give them the power to draw the map, which would in turn give them more congressional seats. Because not only do we draw the map for the state legislature, but the state legislature draws the federal U.S. House map too. So the Republicans have way more seats than they should have in the U.S. House of Representatives right now because of that effort leading up to 2010. Like there's a direct line between the Red Map project that started in 2007, 2008, and how many Republicans are currently in the U.S. House of Representatives.
So those maps are very, very influential. And I guess right now, the last update to my knowledge is that the federal courts ruled that the lawsuit against the congressional maps had to be ruled on in state courts.
These maps are brand new. They didn't exist until a court intervened last year and said you have to draw new maps, which, by the way, is the second time in 2 elections the courts intervened. So this will be my 3rd election in my 3rd district, and I haven't moved anywhere. And this district's only going to exist for 2 years, only 1 term, because as soon as we go back in January for our next session, the first thing we do is draw the new map that's set to last for the next decade, right? Because theoretically, you only have a new map once every 10 years, and you draw it in years that end with 1. So we'll go back in 2021 and draw the new map that'll last theoretically until 2031, which is why this election is everything. This election is the Super Bowl. This is for all the marbles.
And you are up for re-election this year.
Yeah. And my new district is very, very competitive. So you were talking about the numbers I won my last district by. This year, I'll win by 1 vote. Or I'll lose by 1 vote.
I looked up your competitor. Okay. So I've seen you tweet about the budget, and we've talked about the budget and partisan antics that were happening during the legislative session last year. Can you explain why that would be relevant to me as a constituent?
So relevant, because we didn't pass a budget last year because of those antics. And when we don't pass a budget, that affects you in certain direct ways that you can see, particularly with public education. Remember, we talked about 60% of what we spend is public ed. So if we don't budget for that, that 60% is funded at last year's numbers. But we have more students, right, because of growth. And we wanted to do certain things like give teachers a raise. So when there's no budget, you're operating short-staffed, underfunded, basically, public education. It's not a good situation.
And on something that's obviously on everyone's mind, the coronavirus, COVID-19. How do you help to shape the state policy around the coronavirus response?
People need to understand the state response is multifaceted. There's a really long to-do list of things that we need to do. People sort of know what the big pieces are. Folks work. They need money to make sure that they can pay rent. People see that in the paper every day. They don't see all the other stuff that comes with hitting pause on society. Licensure issues and video notarizations and all types of DMV stuff, right? Stuff dealing with, we passed a bill that had like 36 little items in it. And I did a list. I pulled out like the 19 that I thought were most interesting.
I got that list. I read it. Yes.
But like, it's just everything under the sun, right? And then there's the spending of the money. So we've been given about $3.5 billion from the federal government to spend. We spent $1.5 billion of it the first day that we were back in session. We've got another $2 billion to spend, and I bet we need to get some more money from the federal government. So I bet that's going to happen. If we don't get more money from the federal government, we are in a serious fiscal predicament as a state. We can't borrow money, and we can't print money, and it's looking like we're going to be in a $4 billion hole. And that's out of a $24 billion budget. So a $4 billion hit is massive. So if we don't get more money from the federal government, you're talking about some pretty serious cuts.
Can you explain what's currently happening, like what data is being collected and what, as of today, do we have looking forward to? What do we have to look forward to? And today is what, May 13th?
The one that I think is most significant as far as projecting out the COVID situation is hospitalizations. You could look at the number of total infected, but the problem is that's really influenced by how much testing we're doing, and we're still really limited on testing. So I don't really look at the total infected. The hospitalization number, though, that number doesn't lie. That's a true number that gives you a sense of what we're up against. And it also speaks to one of the main elements of the public health crisis that we're concerned about, which is our hospital capacity, right? So right now, our hospitals are about 1/3 capacity from the standpoint of the ICUs and the vents. And the number of hospitalizations over the last 10 days has leveled off a little bit. Well, it's leveled off pretty good, more than a little bit. It's level. It's not going down, though. Originally, the guidance from the CDC and from the White House was you need 2 weeks of it going down before you start to reopen. Well, we're not going to do that because we think we might be at a plateau potentially for for weeks and weeks, potentially several months. And so the idea of saying like, we're going to shut down everything until this plateau goes down, we decided, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is look to make sure that it's still a plateau and still flat and gradually reopen around that. But that's the number people should look at. That's the chart that people should see, because it's the best. It's a bit of a lagging indicator, right? Because you've been sick for 2 weeks by the time you go to the hospital, 10 days, 2 weeks. But that's really, I think, the clearest metric for the overall situation that we're in. And it shows we're in the middle of a fight. We're in the middle of a fight right now. I understand a lot of the fear has gone away. The threat has not. The trouble is exponential growth is just hard for people to imagine because we never encounter it in our daily lives. We never see it. But we're up against an enemy that has the power to grow exponentially. And that's just a tremendous power. So people see us here and they're worried about us being here. And they think that gap is that big. That gap is this big because of the power of exponential growth. And that's why you really can't give this enemy any mercy. If you give it space, it'll use that space to grow exponentially. And then it goes over your defenses faster than you can surge the power of those defenses.
So is there anything ideally that you can speak to that you would like to see, and what elected officials on the state level would have a role in making that happen?
Well, let's transition from talking about public health back to the economy and working people, because what we really need to do is talk about making sure that people feel financially secure during this period. We have 1 million North Carolinians who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. So it's on us to make sure that their lives aren't destroyed as a result of that. We are going to have to retool our unemployment insurance system because it is not up to snuff. It doesn't give people what they need, and its benefits, frankly, we're 50th in the nation for like the stingiest possible approach to unemployment insurance. So we're going to have to take a look at that. And that's not a federal problem. Like, that's a North Carolina problem. So one of the biggest things we could do is unemployment insurance and fix it. The second, make sure that our election is going to be safe and that people feel free to participate in it. And that's going to involve doing a lot of things. The big one that everyone talks about is vote by mail. And we should definitely do that. But there's a checklist of many other things. And if you look at Virginia, they passed a good bill that does 6 or 7 different things. If we could pass that Virginia bill, we'd be in really good shape in North Carolina. See Virginia as sort of the bills that they have passed in this session as sort of being what we aspire to in North Carolina. People are like, what type of agenda would you have? Look at Virginia. Like, they passed the ERA, I think, in the first week, right? They expanded Medicaid. Like, we would do that.
So hopefully for this year, we can get people to come out for the election and really see some positive changes happen on the state legislature, because we would like to mirror Virginia, but Virginia was able to flip. So their state legislature.
I think we have a 50-50 shot of flipping the legislature this year.
Even with the congressional map.
No, the new map was an improvement.
Yes.
It didn't take us from like F to A. It's maybe from F to B minus, which gives us an actual chance for the first time in my political career, an actual chance to take the majority and have a basically fair election.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully we have some safe procedures around, and November is a lot better than what we've had thus far in 2020.
I agree. We should act now to prepare because we don't know what the circumstances are going to be. So assume the worst, which is what you all want us to do as citizens, right?
Yeah.
You want to assume that this is going to be bad still and prepare so you can still participate. So that's what we should do.
All right. Well, that's all my questions. I don't know if you have any last points that you wanted to make or anything we didn't touch on that you would like to speak to.
I think I heard in one of your videos you gave Jordan Peele a really hard time. Us and Get Out. You were painting with a friend, and I was just like, Julesy, Jordan Peele is a great director. And I listened to your points because I was like, maybe she's got a really good case to make.
A good case. I had a very good case. I had a very good case.
Like, Twitter come to life. And then you talk about some plot holes, and I just feel like, look, he had one of the greatest sketch comedy shows of all time, and then he switched genre. And no, you don't think so? I thought Key and Peele was a great show. All right, I'm losing.
I think you like Yacht Rock too, though. I think you tweeted about liking Yacht Rock. So, like, we just have different tastes in things. It's okay. But there's a video I did with Dammit Wesley. He has a artist consortium up at Camp North End here in Charlotte. I don't think that's in your district, but
No, but like I love North End.
Yes.
It's like a spiritual connection that I have with that place. I just love everything.
Yeah, my friends Sabrina and Greg just opened a restaurant, Leah and Louise, and I hope they can survive this. I am there in my prayers because they opened right in the heat of everything, so they haven't been able to fully open the restaurant. They've just been doing takeout, but I'm trying to support all the businesses because I'm like, my brother's a chef, and he's like, yeah, girl, it's not gonna be good on the other side of this. So
that's right.
Seeing what I can do.
Pizza tonight.
Oh, I went there last week. All right, so thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to end this here.